A short look at American education through the Civil War era. Midterm exam by Natasha Snyder. All direct quotes are drawn from The History of American Education, A Great American Experience by Webb. Introduction. The importance of education in forming a nation can hardly be understated, particularly if that nation is intended to be a model of democracy. The citizenry must be educated in order to know what is in their best interests, and they must be moral in order to care for their neighbor's best interests. Webb refers to history as, quote, an interpretive framework through which historians organize and interpret the human experience. End quote. It is equally true that education is the interpretive framework through which humanity organizes and interprets our shared experience, so as to use that collective experience to further our shared desire for progress into the future. The pursuit of an internationally admirable formalized system of education began early and continues to be one of America's top priorities and a source of national pride. Many historical events, ideas, and personalities have affected that pursuit, and it is the objective of this short work to look at some of these from the time of colonization through the Civil War. Education in the Old World and before Jamestown. When Europeans first came to the New World, they came with new ideas about how religion, government, and education should function in relation to the people. However, they could not leave all tradition behind, and they were certainly interested in keeping certain parts of the social order and status quo. This meant that what would become American education began with two underpinnings: the classical writings of Greece and Rome and the tenets of Christianity, particularly as viewed through the lens of the Calvinists. The classics proposed that individuals should seek to learn throughout their lives, inquiring into moral decisions, assumptions, and historical precedents. The Calvinist model stressed the importance of early basic learning so that children could take a hand in their own spiritual development, and by emphasizing the primacy of the individual, reinforced the rugged individualism so seminal to what would become the American character. This model also placed an importance on learning a viable trade. While these early schools were generally limited to young white males, and many times further limited to those who could pay, they were yet more open and public than they might have been without the all-gathering sweep of religion, which has always been a major mover in American education. The further one goes through the progression of a scholarly pursuit, the more this training was to the purpose of preparing young men for church or diplomatic service. It is important to note that, though European settlers were certainly outnumbered by the many indigenous tribes and nations in the New World, they did nonetheless undertake to convert and educate these people to Eurocentric cultural ways by the use of mission and church schools throughout the Americas. This insistence on acculturation to European norms caused a great deal of conflict. Education in colonial America. Schools were established early in colonial America, particularly in the North. Of course, not all of the colonies had the exact same form of schooling. Types of schools varied from region to region, but included town schools, dame schools, charity or pauper schools, and apprenticeship systems, which may have been public, private, or charitable in nature. Many of these were theoretically open to all classes, but charged tuition, so they were really not that open to all. And generally girls were allowed only a very basic education as needed for housekeeping purposes, and might only be able to receive this education during times when there were no males in attendance. Puritan-led New England was home to a fairly systematic scheme of schooling, with government and religious entities working together for a common educational goal, and laws enacted to further those aims. The primary purpose of instruction in the elementary level was, generally, to promote religion and morality, and the teaching philosophy was fairly authoritarian and not very soft-hearted. Secondary schooling was devoted primarily to the study of Latin in preparation for higher education. As one moved further south into the middle colonies, schools were still important, but support was far more scattershot, with a patchwork of sources of support, pedagogies, and standards, as they served a diverse group. Public educational institutions were rare, and free public education even more so. Much of the duties of basic education in the mid-Atlantic colonies fell to those who kept apprentices and various religious denominations. In the deeper South, Education was a privilege afforded only to those lucky few whose parents could pay. The southern colonies were not just slow to develop public education for the masses. They were, in some cases, actively taking a stand against the concept as a radicalizing process that would sow dissatisfaction among the laboring classes and slaves. With the Enlightenment came some changes to philosophies governing education. Locke, for example, was of the belief that the very basic education children had been receiving was not enough to create effective, practical members of society. Rousseau expanded and continued this argument. With the coming of the Great Awakening, higher education saw a great expansion through the founding of many new colleges by various religious sects. Education in the Revolutionary and early national periods. The Declaration of the United States as a free and separate nation affected many facets of life, and it's no surprise that education would be among them. Many schools would find financial support hard to come by, even as teachers left to join the fray for one side or the other. The emerging nation would need the public school system to train a new generation for democracy and to support a new nationalism, according to influential voices Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Rush. Noah Webster felt that this was, in fact, the primary purpose in education. The aim of education in the emerging nation had to move from God and King to God and liberty. However, this aim was not supported by the emerging national government immediately, and according to Webb, neither the Articles of Confederation nor the Constitution mentioned education. It was left up to individual states to do as they choose. In part, this was because of their negative view of the strong central government they had so recently broken from. This era also saw new ideas in the delivery of basic education, including monitorial schools, Sunday schools, and infant schools, in addition to the continuing vigor of town and district schools. This was also a time when the seminal idea of the public high school came into existence, although they would not become common until sometime later. As women were allowed to join in the quest for education in America, their numbers increased enrollment in all of the previously mentioned types of schools. However, they also began to attend schools designed especially for females. Rush and Webster both supported education for females, and the cult of domesticity created a specific ideal for females and a set of expectations for their roles as the early educators of their families. All of this played a part in educating women to what was considered their proper station. The Common School Movement. This period in the mid-19th century was a time of great educational reform as theorists strove for better supported, more practical, and universal structures for education. This was a time of westward expansion in the country and almost exponential increase in population. It was also a time marked by increasing mechanization and urbanization. The universal schooling of the American populace became a litmus test of a civilized town on the frontier and marked a certain level of accomplishment in civic affairs. The movement toward governmentally supported and directed schools meant the creating of supervisory and operational entities as well. State boards of education and superintendents of education were created for that purpose, and local districts were set up to oversee individual schools or small systems. Normal schools, set up specifically for teacher training, were also established on a broad basis in this era. One of the leading voices in this movement was Horace Mann, who was, according to Webb, generally recognized as the, quote, spokesperson for the common school movement. Mann, along with Henry Bernard, believed in true universal education, and Mann was also a proponent of better teacher training. James C. Carter was another advocate of improved teacher training and was also instrumental in creating taxpayer-supported secondary schools. Catherine Beecher would take up the cause for women's education and teacher training for female teachers. The continuing theme of creating a nationalistic, patriotic public was also served by the design of the common schools, as they would assimilate immigrants into a single common language and monoculture, at least ideally. Religious piety and moral fortitude were the prevailing subject matter, in addition to American patriotism and cultural virtues. Of course, this was a universal education reserved generally for white males, but it was nonetheless a huge stride toward actual universal education. It is also worth noting that all religious content, of which there was significant amounts at the time, was Protestant-leaning and sometimes blatantly anti-Catholic. Of course, no taxpayer-supported idea can exist without opposition, and the common school movement was no exception. Both those who wished for less government control and those who were opposed to taxation fought against the movement. Furthermore, some religious schools felt supplanted by public schools that were more secular, and some regions were simply not in accord with the idea of education for all. Later in the 19th century, a sea change in educational theory would begin to emerge. Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi would advocate for student-centric experiential childhood education. This was a major departure from earlier rote memorization and harsh disciplinary measures. This was a concept in education that would be studied far and wide and would have a major impact on future educational theorists. Unfortunately, in the late 19th century, the Civil War would interrupt all forward momentum in America, as brother faced brother in bloody combat. Education in the post-Civil War era. As America began the lengthy process of healing the wounds created by the Civil War, common schools would spread and educational reform would continue. While much of this reform would concentrate on secondary schooling, one important early childhood education innovation would stand out: the creation of kindergartens. This idea was imported from Germany, where a student of Pestalozzi's theories named Friedrich Froebel pioneered it. Margarita Schurz opened the first kindergarten in the U.S., but the first English-language kindergarten was the project of Elizabeth Peabody. With the advances of the American Comprehensive High School, the basic pattern for public school students in the U.S. that we still follow today was set, although these high schools did not magically appear all at once. Before 1870, only about 500 high schools were in existence, according to Witt. However, between 1870 and 1900, the demand and the number blossomed. Compulsory attendance laws went from being a rarity in a few northern states to the national norm, with all states adopting them by 1918. Alongside mandated secondary education came an increased availability of practical or career-oriented education and training, such as manual training, vocational education, and trade schools. Educational opportunities for women also increased, as did some options for minority education, although it would take some time for minorities to have a viable presence in mainstream schools. Junior colleges, universities, and normal schools flourished, with teaching becoming a standardized, professionalized career option. And here's East Tennessee State Normal School, otherwise known as ETSU.